Welcome, welcome. And we are picking up with VaYikra, the book of Leviticus, just starting it today. And I like to say that, we ended Exodus with the construction of the tabernacle. And, well, what are you going to do with it, right? It's not just a question of building a tabernacle, it's a question of using the tabernacle. And that's the whole purpose of building the tabernacle is to use it and to find ways to use it and to connect with the divine. So I was musing, before I muse any further, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
I was musing about this wonderful interpretation that I had read in the Malbim of how the tabernacle itself represents the human body, etc. The various items of the high priest's wardrobe all represent various ways in which to atone for specific kinds of sins, right? Every piece of that wardrobe of his, that it had to do with atonement and sort of those ideas. And of course, now we get into, and we are in the midst of various kinds of offerings. The first offering, just to review a little bit, was the burnt offering, which doesn't say, the Torah does not say specifically what it comes to achieve. It's quite mystifying, right? But the tradition helps us out, and Rashi lets us know that it came to atone, the Olah offering came to atone for positive commandments that were neglected, that weren't performed, right? So if you had a positive commandment to perform and you didn't perform it, the Olah gave you the opportunity to atone for that. Um, there's the whole issue, right, of the need for atonement, that whole idea. And of course, it gives us a view on how the Torah views human life and human effort. And it's sort of interesting that that is the first type of offering that is, and that's what I was musing about too, that that happens to be the very first type of offering that the Torah mentions is this Olah offering, and that it comes to atone for neglected positive commandments. And what is that saying to us in terms of the values, right? That here we are given this life, this this limited life. It is bordered on the beginning and at the end. And what do you do in it? And to see this life as an opportunity to perform positive commandments. And those positive commandments take the world into a different place. Each one of us has our own effort to make, our own talents, our own abilities, and not to neglect that, to make sure that we're on a positive track to try and make this world a little bit better than the way we found it. But to see that as a great value for us, and that not doing that, neglecting that, is deserves atonement, that it's something to regret, it's something to feel remorse about, not taking advantage of every moment that we are given in which to use our minds and our hearts and our bodies and our abilities to do something positive. So then we talked about the Shlamim, right? Or the Todah. These are all related to each other. Peace offerings. These are offerings actually brought for gratitude, to express gratitude. And I've mentioned this. This is a lesson I learned quite a few years ago, which I have found profound ever since, which is that the very foundation of all spirituality is a heart that is grateful, that has a sense of appreciation for the miraculous blessings that take place. Again, very profound ways to look at life in a different kind of way than perhaps our surrounding culture would have us look at it. But to be able to express that thanksgiving, that thanks through this offering. And what is interesting, just a detail, so the Olah sacrifice was totally burnt. The only part that was given to a human being was the skin of the animal, which went to the Kohen as payment for having brought the offering. But the rest of the animal, part of it was burnt on the altar, part of it was burnt in a pure place outside the encampment, etc. And that was the Olah. But with the Shlamim and the Todah, part went on the altar, part went to the priest, and part went to the family bringing the offering. This was an offering that was shared amongst all those parties involved with it. And seeing how that is connected to a sense of thanksgiving. And now we move to something called the chatat, the sin offering. And these come to atone, to give us an opportunity to atone for sins essentially that took place out of ignorance, that were unintentional. But we know that, if you break the law, whether the argument to the police officer who's arresting you isn't to say, well, I didn't know that was wrong. We've learned that pretty early on, that ignorance of the law is no excuse. And that's perhaps one of the reasons why studying Torah is so terribly, terribly important, in the hopes that by being educated, we will avoid stumbling in these kinds of ways. So one of the things that immediately jumps to us, and we're actually in the middle of this, just at the very beginning of it, is that the severity of the sin depends on your position in society. That the higher up in society you are, the more implications there are regarding your committing a sin. And the idea of accountability, the higher up you are. So we start off with the person who's most accountable, the person who brings the offerings to find atonement for the rest of the people of Israel, the high priest. He's the first one we have to deal with. And we're actually in the midst, we're sort of finishing off that part of the high priest's ritual regarding the sin offering he brings. And the way in which these sin offerings are brought is distinct. So first we have the high priest, and then we have the Sanhedrin, the highest court of the land, also responsible for making sure that people know right from wrong, that people are able to avoid falling into sin. And their situation mentioned in the Torah is if the Sanhedrin makes a mistake in judging a certain commandment or whatever, misinforms the people, and then they discover they've made a mistake, a wrong ruling. And so they have to bring a sin offering. And then following that, we have the king. And then finally, we have the individual. And we notice that in the case of the high priest and in the case of the high court, the Sanhedrin, the blood of that offering is brought into the shrine, into the Mishkan itself, and sprinkled on the curtain of the Holy of Holies. But we'll see that and see how the text actually reads. Just a bit of review. So we are, as I said, in the midst of the parts of the offering of the high priest and how this had to be handled. And we're on verse 9, chapter 4, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, chapter 4. So the eight shtei haklayot, and the two kidneys, ve'et hachelev asher alehem, and the fat that is upon them, asher al haksalim, which is on the loins, ve'et hayoteret al hakaved. This is translated as the protuberance of the liver. Okay. Al haklayot yisirena, together with the kidneys, he shall remove it. And let's see how we go here. Let's keep going. Ka'asher, just as Uram, as was removed, right? Literally lifted up, Mishor, from the ox, or the bull, excuse me. An ox, I believe, is a neutered bull. So we'll say the bull, Zevach HaShlamim, of the Shlamim sacrifice. VaYikra, and he should cause them to smoke. That is the HaKohen. The Kohen should cause them to smoke al Mizbach HaOlah, on the altar of the Olah. That is the bronze altar that was outside that was in the courtyard of the tabernacle. There's a Rashi on this. So let's take a look. Ka'asher Yuram. So we're contrasting this, or we're comparing this, right? We're comparing this sin offering to the bull of the Shlamim offerings. Me'otan imurim, from those same parts that were placed on the altar. The part of the animal that was placed on the altar is called the imurim, those parts, right? That's what they're referred to as the imurim. Hamafurashim, that are specified b'shor, in the bull, zevach hashlamim, concerning the peace, the peace offering, the peace sacrifice, the shlamim sacrifice. Question. V'chima pirush bezevach hashlamim. But wait a second. If you compare, because we certainly looked at all these details, right? We were given all these different ways in which the imurim are handled in the sin offering, and then we're told just like the zevach hashlamim. And the point is, there's nothing, right? Shelo piresh kan. There's nothing in the zevach hashlamim, in the offering of the shlamim, shelo piresh kan, that wasn't explained here. It's one word for word practically, right? It's exactly the same items. Ella. So what's the reason for this? Lahakishor l'shlamim. So this is to connect it to the shlamim offering. Ma shlamim lishnan. Just as the shlamim offering has to be for its sake. In other words, when the shlamim sacrifice is brought, it has to be done. Everyone involved in that offering has to do it for the sake of that offering, right? It has to be done consciously and verbally for the sake of that particular offering. Afze lishmor. So this chatat, this sin offerings must be done for their own sake. You have to say, I'm bringing this offering for the sake of a chatat, for a sin offering. Just that's one comparison. Uma shlamim, and just as shlamim, shalom le'olam, they bring peace to the world. That's what I would understand by this. Wow. The comparison of an apology, of seeking forgiveness, to thanksgiving, that the two are somehow connected or worthy of meditating about that. Because the thanksgiving offering, they're called shlamim because they bring peace to the world. There is nothing like appreciation. But likewise, there's nothing like seeking forgiveness. These are all foundations of peace. Afze shalom.
So,
Yes, David.
so wait. So what you just said, if I got it correctly, is that basically the offering, everything is identical. It's
Yes.
just you have to state the intent is different. Is that the idea, or is there anything else
No, you, okay, hold it, you'll see. Okay.
Okay, okay.
There is a legal principle that Rashi is going to share with us that has to do when it comes to the laws regarding offerings.
But yeah, I was just trying to understand how.
Of course.
Distinguish.
He's
Okay,
told you why one is compared to the other.
okay,
He hasn't really explained yet why the need to, to iterate the specifics regarding the imurim for both.
got it.
So done. That's in the text, right? Right. So let's,
Okay,
all right. Uveshchikat kodshim. And when it comes to the slaughter of the holy items, that is regarding the sacrificial service, right? Matzrichu lilmod, right? Hey menu. We need to learn from this, what we just saw, right? This repetition of iteration, right? She'en lemedim lamed min halamed bekdoshim. That you cannot derive an application of the law by influence, by inference, excuse me, by something that is derived by inference in another similar case. In other words, what we learned by inference regarding Shlamim cannot be learned, therefore, by inference regarding Chatats. They have to be specified by the Torah. That when it comes to those thoughts of those items, those legal issues, the specifics regarding the laws of sacrifice, there's a higher standard regarding how those are learned out, that they need to be specified somehow by the Torah. We know, if I'm correct, we know that there are hermeneutic principles, there are laws of inference, the 13 laws of Rabbi Yishmael, for example, as to how one derives an application of law in the Torah through these particular logical, legal and logical arguments, which are considered as applicable as Torah law, as something that's explicitly stated in the Torah. That that there are other situations that may happen that one can learn, even though they're not explicitly stated in the Torah, but by the application of these logical principles, those laws derived logically are just as valid as Torah law. They're not rabbinic law, they're Torah law. And the practical implications of whether a law is a Torah law or a rabbinic law is important. There are distinctions. I will say that the nature of rabbinic law, for the most part, is as a protection for the Torah law. In other words, the rabbis looked at human nature and said, we need to institute this particular law to prevent the Torah law from infractions, even accidentally. I will give you an example. I think this is a legitimate example. And that is, so on Shabbat, you're not allowed to kindle a flame. You're not allowed to kindle a flame. A rabbinic law would be that you're not allowed to touch matches on Shabbat. There is no Torah law that says you're not allowed to touch matches. But the rabbinic law would be that if people start playing with matches or touching matches, inevitably at some point, someone is going to strike a match and light a flame. So that's an example of rabbinic law, but Torah law is different. Okay, that's this. And what we're saying here is that when it comes to sacrifices, I believe what he's saying here is that you can't simply derive a law regarding the sacrificial system just by inference. Logical inference doesn't matter. Okay. Finishing up this Rashi, the Perek Ezahu Mekuman. So there is a chapter, right, in, I believe, the tractate Zevachim that deals with sacrifices. It's called Where is the Place, Ezahu Mekuman, where, for example, where the end of certain types of offerings were slaughtered, and where that took place, etc. And there's a chapter that starts off with the delineation of the various types of sacrifices and where they were to be slaughtered. So this principle is discussed in that chapter in the Talmud as to the fact that you cannot do this, right? You cannot simply use inference to learn a law regarding the sacrificial system. Going on. Al kaved, al klayot, al rosho, al kra'av. So it says, literally it means on the liver, on the kidneys, on its head, on its legs. That's the al, right? Kulan lashon tosefet. All this has to do with addition, adding something to it. Okay. Hein kamo milvad. So in other words, we need to understand this word al that means on, to mean on in the sense of as well as, besides. Milvad means besides. So it doesn't mean on in terms of a position, right, on top of. It means as well as, on in that sense. You can see right underneath here, and I'll just point it to it with my cursor, right? When it comes to rules or laws regarding sacrifices, we cannot apply one law that was derived by inference to a different circumstance. It has to be stated explicitly in Scripture. So we'll do a little bit more. Okay. Here we go. Let's make sure. Did we do this? Yes, we did. Okay. Did that first. Verse 11. Ve'et or hapar, and the skin, right, the hide of the bull, ve'et kol basaro, and all its meat, right? So, incidentally, one of the distinctions in terms of sin offering is that a high priest had to bring a bull, right? Um, an individual basically would bring a kid, a young goat, or possibly a lamb if they could not bring a young goat. The Torah will give us that option when we finally get there. So, it kol basaro, all its meat, al rosho, see what I mean? The al here means as well as its so as well as its head, the al kra'av, as well as its legs, the kirbo, and its entrails, u pirsho, and its dung, right? Has to bring all those things. So, v'hotzi et kol hapar el michutz lamachaneh, right? So he's going to take the remaining parts of the bull outside the encampment, el, to the place. Whoops, sorry. Here we go. Makom, to the place. Tahor, it has to be a pure place. It cannot be impure. El shefech hadeshin, to the place where the ash is poured out. That is the ash that is left on the altar. They pour out that there. V'saraf oto, and he is to burn it. This is these parts of the bull that he's bringing out there. Al eitzim ba'esh, on wood in fire. He should use fire, burn it on a wood fire. Al shefech hadesh, look at this, he says it again. Al shefech hadesh and yisaref, it shall be burned on the place where the ash heap, in other words. Notice the repetition there. Okay, let's take a look at Rashi. So here we are. Okay, one word. El makom tahor, to a pure place. So the Torah is mentioning this. So what's the significance? Lefi sheyesh michutz la'ir, because it has to say specifically that it needs to be a pure place, because outside of the city, makom muchan letum'ah, there are places that are set aside for impurity. So, for example, lahashlich avanim menugaot, that is where they would take the stones that were affected by leprosy. Okay, so remember, actually, well, I can't say remember because this comes later in the book of Leviticus, but we're assuming that you're familiar already with the book of Leviticus. And we know that there was something called leprosy of houses, and those had to be removed. Stones that were affected by leprosy had to be removed and taken outside the city and deposited there. Impure, very high level of impurity. Uleve takfarot, and likewise for a cemetery, right? A place of graves. These were supposed to be outside the city. And so for that reason, he has to say, michutz lamachaneh, right? So he has to say both that it's outside the encampment, zeh shehu chutz la'ir, and that's the same thing as outside of the city, sheyehei makom tahor, that it has to be a pure place. outside the city, because there are places outside the city that are not pure. Michutz lamachane, outside the encampment. Chutz, so what encampment? Chutz l'shalosh machanot. So again, if you've read the book of Numbers or the beginning of the book of Numbers, you realize that essentially there were three encampments that the Israelites encamped in. The central encampment was the tabernacle and the courtyard. And around those four sides was Moses and Aaron and their families, and the other three Levitical families, four groups that were outside. That was a Mechane Leviyah, right, the encampment of the Levites. And then outside of that was the rest of the Israelites. That was the third encampment. Ubeveit olamim, right? And if we're talking now about the temple, ultimately the temple, chutz la'ir, we would have to be talking about outside the city of Jerusalem, kamo shepirshuhu rabotenu, just as our sages explained the Masechet Yoma in the tractate Yoma. That's a tractate that deals with Yom Kippur, with the Day of Atonement, uve Sanhedrin, and in the tractate Sanhedrin. El Shefech Hadeshin, to the ash heap, to the place where the ash is poured. Makom Shishochim Bo Hadeshin, he just explains. That's what it means. It means the place he's talking about, where one pours out the ashes. Hamisulak min habisbeach, which were removed from the altar. Kemoshe Katuv, as it states explicitly, v'hotzi et hadeshin el michutz lamachaneh, says he shall remove the ashes of the altar, understood, outside the camp, to a place outside the encampment. Al shefech hadeshin yisaref, so this is that repetition. On the ash heap, it shall be burned. Okay, so notice the use of the passive voice. She'ein Talmud Lomar, which is not necessary. Scripture did not need to tell us this, right? Ella, but for the sake, lelamed, to teach us, she'afilu ein sham deshen. Even if there is no ash in that location, it still has to be burned there. And that's why we have that repetition, to tell us that just because he calls it the place where the ashes are poured, even if there aren't literally any ashes there, it still has to be done. This all has to be done regarding the sacrifice, the sin offering of the high priest. And I'm going to stop the sharing here. Okay, all right. So unless you have a question for the record, I am going to stop the recording.